Howdy, and welcome to Farmers Fight. Today, we are officially kicking off this series by doing what every good historian should do at the beginning of any study, a rousing and laborious literature review. Of course, I am joking, but only slightly. I understand literature reviews aren't everybody's cup of tea, and they certainly aren't mine, but I think a review of what has been said about populist thought is necessary to tee up our discussion of the historical populists going forward. Although populism as a subject is pretty expansive, I have attempted to keep things concise by breaking this episode into two parts. The first half will be a brief introduction to what populism means in general, with the second half looking at different ways populism has been defined by historians, sociologists, economists, and political scientists. If you would like to review the sources for this episode, put some change in the jar, or send me an email to tell me I stink, you can find me at farmersfightpodcast.com. I also got the RSS feed set up so you can now find me on iTunes and any other podcast apps. So take an aspirin, get a fizzy water, or do whatever it is people do when they listen to some guy ramble about political science. This is Farmers Fight. Episode 2, An Introduction to Populism. We hear the term populism in the news a lot these days. The turmoil set in motion by Brexit in the UK and the election of Donald Trump in the United States caught many people by surprise. But if you've been aware of the growing political anger in the West over the past few decades, then the rise of populism probably was not much of a shock. But what is populism? Where does it come from? What are its goals? Is it any different from other sorts of political phenomena? How has its meaning changed over time? Moreover, do modern standard-bearers of populist politics have anything in common with the original populists of the Gilded Age? Like other categories of social action, populism in the modern sense is generally hard to pin down. It is both rich and multifaceted in its meaning while being horribly bastardized at the same time. In some ways, it is schizophrenic, possessing both conservative and progressive, even utopian traits simultaneously. It is coherent and yet deeply incoherent. It is simple yet complex. You see where I'm going with this. Some scholars assert that modern populism is not a full or coherent ideology, while some still debate if modern populism even exists at all. Political scientists Cas Mudde and Christopher Karlswasser have said that the use of populism in the modern context is too vague to describe specific political movements in multiple regions of the world. By the same token, New Left historian Norman Pollock and conservative political scientist Keith Minogue feared in the late 1960s that the meaning of populism was largely lost to most, and had become little more than a buzzword or a political pejorative. But the word populism is based on the American populist movement that spanned from the close of Reconstruction to its collapse in 1896. Some include the Russian Narodnik of the 1860s through 70s in this definition, since they too were more aligned with classical populist action and thought. But if we are being nitpicky, then any application of the term in the modern context is at best a vague acknowledgement of the American populist. But because most politicos are not academics, populism has been interpreted in a variety of ways. In many cases, the looseness in how the term populism is applied has made it difficult to derive anything approaching a cogent definition. But if we were to define populism, we should first clearly define what is meant by the word, which is not very easy. As political scientist Peter Wills said, to each his own definition of populism, according to the academic axe he grinds. And this is a tad tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless accurate, as many definitions of populism can exist depending on somebody's view. Today, when talking heads call something populist, they are usually referring to the rudimentary core of populist politics, namely an adversarial dichotomy between the common citizen against an elite, or a seemingly reactionary and uncivil expression of anger and displeasure with the status quo. What passes for populism these days is often a blend of base populist sentiment and some other ideology. Think of populism behaving like those tiny birds that pick the flesh out of crocodiles' teeth, or those fish that hang on to sharks to scoop up the extra food. My point is, contemporary populism is more a set of ideas and sentiments looking for a host ideology to live in symbiosis with. It is not a viable vehicle for achieving political change on its own. At its best, populism is a framework that helps individuals interpret and comprehend political and social realities while providing group identity. If we open our dictionaries, populism is defined as, quote, a political approach that strives to appeal to the ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by an established elite group. The quality of appealing to or being aimed at ordinary people. Moreover, Webster's dictionary defines a populist as, quote, a member of a political party claiming to represent the common people, a believer in the rights, wisdom, or virtue of the common people. So with these two vague definitions in mind, we can start to put some meat on the bones. To begin, we should explain what is meant by the people, because the people, and yes, I'm using air quotes here, is central to both individual movements and populism in general. First off, populism is inherently a defensive ideology that seeks to protect a defined people, culture, or society from an outside force. The people often refers to the members of a selected group, which can be derived from a common set of criteria, usually involving socioeconomic status, political power, or nationality. Modern expressions of populism have incorporated religion and race into the mix of extolled virtues, but these were not necessarily explicit requirements among its analogues. But it is important to note that the concept of the people is not immutable and can change depending on the context. The imagery of a unified and disaffected mass has more to do with opposing the dominant elite culture, which tends to view the taste, values, and judgments of the average citizen, or the people, with suspicion or even outright contempt. This is partly why populists adopt digs or monikers of inferiority bestowed upon them by the dominant culture. From hayseeds to deplorables, the goal is the same: to mobilize an angry and silent majority against a defined enemy, often a cultural elite or the institutional extension of it. According to Moudet and Kalswasser, and forgive my pronunciations here, the people in liberal democratic countries traditionally believe that they are the sovereign or the rightful rulers of the state. The pair attributes this legacy to both the American and French revolutions, but I would argue it goes a little bit further back, with even maybe the concept of popular sovereignty within republicanism or Enlightenment philosophy. This concept brings us around to the true meaning or reason for populist uprisings. A conflict between the elite and the people is often a case of disconnect between the ruled and ruler. Populism simply seeks to correct such an imbalance by returning control over government back to the people. Still, scholars believe that the vagueness of the people, and I'm using those air quotes again, renders it useless in any diagnostic sense. On the other hand, its vagueness is seen as the concept's ultimate strength, since the people can encompass any constituency a given movement cares to incorporate. This loose framing can bind seemingly unlike groups together behind a common cause, and it is in this fact that we see the greatest utility of the people to various movements. On the other side of the populist dichotomy is the elite, who tend to view society in much the same way as the people do, just inverted. Elites see themselves as the virtuous and moral group, whereas the people are the unruly mob. A dishonest, vulgar, and dangerously stupid mob at that, one who is rightly subjugated to the political and cultural will of those elites. As journalist Walter Lippmann stated in the 1920s, society is made up of only two types of people: agents and bystanders. The elite are most certainly the agents of society, or at least they see themselves that way. Unlike the people, the elite believe that they are the only ones able to act executively on their own opinion to address an issue, while the common folk are just bystanders or spectators. The elite by default are insiders, and everyone else is an outsider with regard to decision-making. This mentality can result in the outright rejection of democracy, or at least provide a limited version of it. It can take on authoritarian qualities or a Praetorian-esque guardianship, which excludes the masses from internal decision-making as well. But populism is more than just a dichotomy between the people and the elite. This is why I want to explore several key interpretations of populism made by academic scholars over the years. Rather than bore you to death with a legit literature review, I have done my best to whittle down this second part of the episode to a few selected sources. The first three sources are essays taken from the seminal work Populism, Its Meaning and National Character, written in 1969. The second is my distillation of American historiography on the subject, and the third will be a fast and loose look at various schools of analysis presented in Populism, a very short introduction by Moudet and Kalswasser. The contributions found in Populism, Its Meaning and National Character have been instrumental in shaping this episode, but I ask that you bear in mind that those three contributions specifically are more focused on a general or global view of populism. They do make some reference to the historical populists, but they are just political scientists trying to derive some meaning for populism as they see it today. Our first essay comes from Donald McCrae, a sociologist at the London School of Economics. His piece, Populism as an Ideology, seems like a good place to start. The first item that McCrae sees as central to populist ideology is its interest in defending a specific people, culture, society, and way of life. Something we can call a defense of the group. This aspect is so central to populism that it is literally in the name, or at least with the Russian Narodnik, who are sometimes referred to as practicing peopleism. McCrae states that populism, quote, asserts as its character of political action a belief in a community, and usually a Volk, which is just people, nation, or race, as uniquely virtuous. Professor Isaiah Berlin summed it up best when he said that populism is simply, quote, a belief in the value of belonging to a group or culture. Another way of putting it is that populism is against rootlessness. Populism usually seeks some level of egalitarianism among the group, often with the intention of solidifying an identity from which to project a shared culture as well as any grievances. The goal is to recapture a shared past while seeking to regenerate the present in opposition to the prevailing society. This idea is far from new and can be traced back to the likes of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who stressed such a need for belonging to what he called a folk spirit or culture. Similarly, Johann Herder, who is sometimes called the German Rousseau, said that a nation is not made up of separate classes, but only one group called the Volk, or the people, that are shaped by a common culture, tradition, education, heredity, and even climate. In this way, we can say that populism values fraternity with an emphasis on the collective group. It is, in some ways, a form of tribalism or collectivism, since it views what is good for the group as being good for the individual. But a feature that comes along with this constructed identity is a notion that McCrae calls asymmetry of civil principles, meaning the populace can demand the highest level of moral, behavioral, and political virtue from others while not adhering to it themselves. This is a bit ironic since another prominent feature of populist ideology is the belief in the moral superiority of its members when compared to the rest of society. This allows populists to see their group as the most virtuous and thus the most fit to survive. Couple this with the second aspect, a disdain for any foreign or outside alien entity, and you have yourself a recipe for some insular, if not outwardly suspicious and intolerant attitudes. The second major theme in McCrae's analysis is what I call anti-modernity. After the concept of the people or the group, the state of society is the next important ideological component of populism. McCrae makes a convincing case that the populist worldview can be boiled down to a sort of primitivism. That is to say, it is a pining for a connection with the natural world and with our fellow man. In this way, populism is or employs a sort of nostalgia inherent in conservative and traditional worldviews. It is a fetishization of the good old days before some outside force came along and ruined it. Similar notions can be found in the ancient Greeks and the Chinese Taoists, but the sentiment is basically the same. Everything was great before they showed up. For the American populist of yore, restoration and preservation of the peasant community or the village life of the yeoman farmer was the ideal. We will explore the myth of the yeomanry in future episodes, but for now, keep in mind that the yeoman or the ideal of the yeoman is very important to American populism in general. In the Third World, or with formerly colonized people, the rural mythos of European populism is expressed as a yearning for a pre-colonial society. Ideals such as a perfect tribalism or even a village democracy in West Africa or India are a few examples. Similarly, all late modern populist movements tend to express a sort of romantic primitivism. In essence, populism is not a political ideology, but an emotive one that seeks, quote, restoration of the verities of the soil, or in other words, it seeks to return man and society back to a pure state of being. In populism, we combine a rebellion against the alienated human condition, that idea that integral personality was maimed by the social division of labor, a belief in the sacredness of the soil and those who till it, a belief in equality of status of all cultivators, a faith in belonging to a local, fixed, virtuous, and consensual community, and a belief that this virtue could only perish by usurpation, conspiracy, and the workings of an active alien urban vice. McCrae goes on to point out that a base urge in populist ideology is a yearning for, quote, a healing of the breach between men and their nature by simplicity, spontaneity, aesthetics, and largely agrarian virtue. That is why appeals aimed at a common people with a shared history and destiny work well in both thin and fuller ideological systems. McCrae makes this clear when he says that, quote, Maoism was not populism, but populism was an important part of Maoism. This sort of romantic primitivism is an underlying condition of the populist worldview that refuses to accept any doctrine of social, political, or historical inevitability. As McCrae states, quote, populist ideology is, after all, yet another attempt to escape the burden of history. But as a consequence, populists typically turn to a belief in an instant, if not imminent, apocalypse that can be mediated only by heroic leaders or the populists themselves, who seek nothing short of an equally apocalyptic restoration. It is true that populism seeks to remedy what they see as an unnatural turn in history or society, but disillusionment with the present feeds another aspect of populist ideology, a strong dependence on conspiracy. This attraction to conspiratorial thinking serves the purposes of distilling complex or incomprehensible issues into something that can be easily understood and disseminated. McCrae expounds on this tendency by explaining that contempt for the foreigner is tied to the notion that, quote, untutored agrarian virtue can only fail through subversion or the sinister magic of an incomprehensible alien, meaning we are only suffering because of those outsiders. Because populism is inherently a defensive ideology, focusing on a specific people against an elite, it is prone to frame themselves as under attack by an outside force, who at times intentionally orchestrates their conditions. By this same token, populists often engage in what McCrae calls the theory of personality. This theory can be boiled down to what Russian sociologist Nikolai Malovsky described as a consequence of the modern labor system. He said that specialized jobs in the division of labor fragments and dilutes the innate personality of an individual. Or it creates a habit of mind in someone doing a specific occupation to express themselves in a one-sided and unrealized way. The whole idea is a modified form of primitivism in that people are alienated from their fellow man in a highly regimented division of labor. As the remedy to this, Herder said that a society of social uniformity with a limited division of labor is the best way to heal the breach between the individual and community. The idea that the society would be, quote, consensual and uniform, and thus make the individual free of all burden and alienation is not a new one, nor is it confined to a left-right view of populism. McCrae says that populism ultimately is not about economics, politics, or even society. It is about personality, and about personality in a moral sense. It claims that the individual should be a complete man, one who's connected to their fellow man and the world around them. The third overarching tenet of populist ideology is what McCrae sees as an inherent conservative force behind populist ideals. Conservatism can be defined as a desire for the continuity between past and present. It also seeks to preserve cultural traditions and customs. In this way, we can find many conservative impulses within both left and right-wing variants of populism, as both desire to make a perfect present and future based on an idealized past and exaltation of a defined group. McCrae points out that populism is both conservative and utopian, which doesn't seem like much of a paradox to me, since utopia literally means no place. Because the perfect future and the idealized past do not exist, safer in the minds of the populist, their vision of those things can take on a conservative hue while still being progressive in orientation. While McCrae's attribution of conservatism to populist thought conflicts with much of American historiography on the subject, it is important to note that the American populists describe their own movement as conservative. While their actions, bedfellows, and desired reform certainly were progressive in the context, it is worth pointing out that such programs as the Omaha Platform may have been motivated by a desire to preserve cherished customs and traditions as much as it was about change and reform. But to throw a wet blanket on McCrae's entire thesis, many scholars believe that populism is in fact not an ideology, or at best it's a thin ideology, meaning a easily discernible set of ideas are encapsulated within the term populism, but it doesn't offer a cogent system of political action. McCrae himself said, quote, "The ideology of populism remains a poor, if insignificant thing." But for a slightly different take, we can look to economist Peter Wills, also a professor at the London School of Economics. He approaches populism as a syndrome rather than a doctrine or ideology. By syndrome, Wills means that populism is a set of symptoms that arise in response to a set of conditions, usually economic, cultural, and the like. This brings us to Wills's first point. He sees populism as arising when a large group becomes self-conscious and feels alienated from the centers of power. Like McCrae, Wills sees populism being based on the idea that, quote, virtue resides in the common people, who are usually the overwhelming majority, and in their collective traditions. Wills's second point is that while agrarianism has historically been the basis for populist movements, they have also taken hold in urban and industrial settings. A large part of this stems from what Wills calls the populist opposition to social and economic inequality. But their opposition is typically limited to institutions they just don't like. The financial or banking establishment has been a constant target for populists in the United States. Best exampled in the historical populist hatred of the Eastern moneyed elite, or the hostility towards the Federal Reserve System among modern populists. Such disdain for the owners of capital and financiers is another feature of romanticized primitivism, because the populist economic ideal is usually, at least in the historical sense, the cooperative. Wills asserts that cooperatives are a third way, or a third social form. For Americans, this ideal is rooted in the community or the village mill. The cooperative can be consumer or producer-based, but is neither capitalist nor socialist to any strong degree. But populism does not seek to dispense with inequality, as it is neither pro-class warfare and generally accepts traditional inequalities as the result of personal choice. Still, the intellectual class of populists are often motivated by a sympathy towards the poor, which may stem from a belief in the virtue of the common people. Wills asserts that many populist intellectuals themselves are anti-intellectualists, likely because of their relationship with the common people. As was true with the intellectuals of the Russian Narodnik, many American populist thinkers came from educated or bourgeois backgrounds. This is not always the case, but political figures such as William Jennings Bryan is indicative of the leader who comes from the learned professions. Populism is also anti-science and anti-technocratic, which seems to align with its conservative worldview. Unsurprisingly, it is pro-religion, but against any large or powerful religious establishment. Actually, populism is generally anti-establishment and suspicious of any overarching or outside authority. Thus, it should come as no surprise that they are opposed to the state, but only when it affects them directly. Populists see the state much like classical liberals. They want it to be helpful, but are pragmatic about its use and fear it becoming too strong. But these ideological tenets may explain why populism is so bad at forming political parties or counter-institutions of political power. Lastly, Wills reminds us that, quote, populism is not to be thought of as intrinsically bad. Like other political modalities, harmful and distasteful things have been attributed to populist movements around the world. But it has also been a force for positive change when wielded by honest and democratic people. Perhaps the most focused contribution to our study comes from political scientist Keith Minogue. In his essay, Populism as a Political Movement, he focuses his analysis on the historical American populist and asserts that they alone, and to some extent the Russian Narodnik, are worthy of the title populist. Like Norman Pollock, Minogue focuses on the importance of context when studying historical movements, because without awareness of the context, the, quote, moral and political assertions of populists will allow us to draw any conclusion we like. Viewing issues devoid of their historical setting and context is a quick path to misunderstanding or even misappropriating the ideas, events, and history altogether. An example of this can be found in the interpretation of the American populist historical legacy. The movement has been dubbed the ancestor of the radical right, while simultaneously being championed as the forebearer of the progressive left in the United States. Both assertions are based on the populist rhetoric of self-realization, class struggle, and the rights of man. But it is this very rhetorical tradition that scholars have based varying assertions, interpretations, and even reinterpretations as to the nature of the populist. For example, Pollock asserts that populism and Marxism arrived at similar understandings of industrial capitalism around the same time, albeit on different sides of the Atlantic. While a notable strain of anti-capitalism did exist within the movement, the historical context and ideology of the larger movement paints a different picture, one that is not anti-capitalist but something more akin to producerism with a general emphasis on the rule of law. Minogue also focuses on the populist aversion to change. Technological change was, and often is, the driver behind a host of economic and social strife that seems to accompany populist movements. If we view populism as an emotive phenomena, then it is possible to see how other types of social strain can animate these movements. This is certainly the case with the historical populists who were experiencing turmoil wrought by the Second Industrial Revolution and the First Age of Globalization. Pollock and Minogue point out that a direct result of these changes were groups like the Knights of Reliance and the Texas Farmers Alliance. Of course, other aspects of the populist ideology, or syndrome as Wills puts it, attempted to prescribe the causes of rural poverty and low agricultural prices with general conspiratorial thinking and appeals to agrarian virtue and cooperative action. The point that Minogue wishes the reader to take away is that, quote, any movement will identify any enemy with an eye to the acquisition of its allies. By pointing to industrialization, populists position themselves to attract both industrial workers, disaffected populations, and non-populist groups across the country. As we will see, their critique of monopolistic capitalism gave the movement the ability to ally with groups that would not have considered themselves conservative or even populist. Building on the primitivism of McCrae and the hostility towards the urban, Minogue points out that the divide between urban and rural cultures was a key component of American populist thought. Much like the old socialist slogan, "We work for all, we feed all," rural populists felt that they were essential to the functioning of American society and civilization in general, but were denied its spoils at the same time. Some of this must stem from traditional city-rural division that typically defined the countryside as dumb and the city as a place of sinful and gluttonous luxury who parasitically fed on the hard-working people of the countryside. But industrialization brought another meaning to this age-old divide as the city came to represent the dehumanized man of the modern capitalist system. This was contrasted by the natural and virtuous farmer who, in their minds, represented the old humane values that would save all mankind from the evils of wage and industrial slavery. Overcoming this divide is one of the more extraordinary features of the American populist, but it is important to keep in mind that many within the American agrarian class were motivated by a loss or a sense that they were losing their traditional place within society, largely to industrialization and globalization. Minogue also brings up the fragility of the historical populist movement. While Goodwin and other New Left historians make a good case for the more reform-minded aspects of the historical populist, it can't be denied that their movement was easily derailed as economic hardships lessened. Of course, this wasn't the case for everyone involved in the movement, but as conditions improved after 1896, a cogent populist movement ceased to exist. Meaning it is impermanent if the conditions that brought it into being dissipate. Since we are discussing the historical American populist, it only makes sense to give a brief overview of the interpretations held by American historians, the majority of who subscribe to what Moudet and Koswasser call the popular agency approach. This view sees populism as a general positive force for mobilization of the common citizenry and for the development of a communitarian style of democracy. Members of the Gilded Age populist movement dubbed this communitarian vision a cooperative commonwealth, or my favorite, a Arcadian humanism. This positive view of populism seems to appear around the 1930s, as exampled by historian John D. Hicks's book The Populist Revolt and C. Van Woodward's biography of Tom Watson. The historical populists began as a true grassroots uprising of Southern and Western farmers and operated on a unified social and class basis. They helped to organize a coalition of other social movements who shared common interests, eventually creating an organized political party that ran candidates for president and won governorships as well as a host of other state and local offices. But by the end of the 19th century, the movement lost its direction and dissolved, with many returning to the political parties from which they came, and others going into the more radical Socialist Party. Similar to historian Frederick Jackson Turner, Hicks took the view that populism was an inevitable reaction to the rapid westward expansion and ultimate end of the frontier. Hicks saw populism as a healthy regional defense of democracy by a genuinely downtrodden and oppressed citizenry. By the 1950s, however, the praise populism was receiving from liberal historians began to be challenged as figures like Columbia University professor Richard Hofstadter saw the populist in less romantic terms and more as the precursor to McCarthyism. Others, like UCLA professor Theodore Saludos, presented evidence of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and other reactionary qualities typically associated with the modern political right in the United States. Still, far more historians of the New Left came to the defense of the populist legacy over the years. Historians like Norman Pollock and Lawrence Goodwin took up the view of Woodward and Hicks and found the populists to be both ahead of their time and radical egalitarians. In his influential book, Democratic Promise, The Populist Movement in America, Professor Lawrence Goodwin frames the populists of the 1870s through 1890s as an indigenous democratic movement that sought a better way of life, quote, through popular engagement with politics. Others saw populism as a response to pressures created by a multitude of factors, including the Civil War, the industrialization of America, the first stage of globalization, as well as monetary and economic issues. For Goodwin, these pressures awoke native communitarian values in a population most akin to the European proletariat, the small yeoman farmer. In 1965, Norman Pollock said that the Populists, quote, sought the establishment of a just social order founded on a democratized industrial system and a transformation of social cause, each reinforcing the other in the direction of a greater concern for the welfare of all. Such a positive view of the Populists has persisted into the present. For example, in his 1993 book, American Populism, Robert C. McMath goes so far as to assert that the Populists were the closest thing to, quote, America's own brand of communism, at least in the eyes of the corporate giants of the day. Such analysis is not without merit, as contemporary populist literature and newspapers communicated a message of collective action and a communitarianism in the language of Jackson and Jefferson. Moudet and Kalswasser note that the popular agency approach takes a broader and narrower view of populism than other approaches. But I believe that this is a general feature of historical research and interpretation, rather than other fields that attempt to scientifically determine where populism stands on the spectrum of human political thought. The last of our sources is a fast and loose review of Populism, a very short introduction by the aforementioned Cass Mood and Christoval Kalswasser. Rather than focus on modern expressions of populism, I have pulled out a few schools of thought that they present that I think are worth mentioning. The first school of thought is developed by Argentinian political theorist Ernesto Laclau. This view posits that populism is not just a positive emancipatory force, but the very essence of politics itself. This approach also sees liberal democracies as the problem and a new form of radical or popular democracy as the solution. He posits that populism can, quote, reduce conflicts into politics and foster the mobilization of excluded sectors of society with the aim of changing the status quo. The next view is what Moudet calls the social economic view. Developed by economists Rudy Dornbush and Jeffrey Sachs, this approach is characterized by massive spending financed by foreign debt, followed by major hyperinflation. The term populist economics has largely overtaken the model since later Latin American populists engaged in neoliberal economic policies. The notion of too much redistribution of wealth and generous government spending characterizes the contemporary concept. The leader approach sees modern populist movements as being driven by a charismatic leader, one who draws on direct support from their base. It is more common to find adherents of this view within Latin or non-Western studies. Think Hugo Chavez, meaning a strong or charismatic leader who directly appeals to or is supported by his followers. The final style of populism is what is known as folkloric. This typically refers to a style of politics employed by a party apparatus to mobilize voters. This approach usually involves, and I'm quoting here, amateurish and unprofessional political behavior used to maximize attention and popular support. Think of this as bucking the norms in regard to dress and language. This is done to differentiate the candidate from the established political norms. While recognizing the validity of these other concepts, Moudet and Kalswasser attempt to bring a singular definition to both historical and modern populism, one that excludes non-populist movements. As a result, the two formed their own view of how they see populism, known as the ideation approach. This approach says that society consists of two homogeneous and antagonistic groups at the core of populist reactions. The tension between a pure people and a corrupt elite can be viewed as a struggle to define politics by the general will of the people. Moudet and Kalswasser also see populism as an ideology, albeit a thin one. By ideology, they are talking about a set of ideas about society and humanity and their purpose in that world. The concept of a thin ideology with regard to populism just simply means that it is not a fully fledged ideology like liberalism or fascism. Now that we have heard some different ways of viewing populism, we should have a solid basis for understanding some of its characteristics and the forces that drive it. I planned on doing another primer episode on proto-populism after this one, but I figure one episode on non-subject matter specific history was enough. So next episode, we will begin our overview of the historical context that birthed the agrarian revolt by introducing Reconstruction. So stay tuned for the next episode of Farmers Fight.